Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD podcast. I'm your host, Patti Kasper, your FASD coach. And once again, I am bringing back to you, welcome to the mic, Dr. Jerrod Brown. This is always such a good, everybody grab your pad of paper and a pencil, because as always, I'm sure there's going to be 1,000 notes you're going to want to take. So welcome, Jerrod.
Thanks, Patty. Hi, everyone. Hope you're well.
All right. So our topic today is that critical first 1,000 days of life. Jerrod, this is something that you asked to bring to everybody. Why don't you fill us all in on what's got your passion going for this?
Depending on what article you read, the first 1,000 days of life are really responsible for the overwhelming majority of health outcomes through the lifespan. So basically, first 1,000 days of life, day one of conception, all the way up to age 2. So a lot of times when I give talks to different groups on a variety of topics, they don't think of the prenatal world. They think about what happened after birth. Okay, early childhood, that's where it's at. Well, yes, that's a big part, but equally important, if not even more important, in my opinion, what happened in utero during the 9 months. Obviously, you and I talk about FASD all the time, which is relates perfectly to this topic. But I'd be curious, Patty, too, how I don't know too many folks in the FASD world that talk about the first 1,000 days of life, at least use that term.
Yeah.
So most of it's common sense. We all know it's important when you're pregnant not to use drugs, alcohol, tobacco, eating healthy, all of those things. Any one of those things could jeopardize health outcomes. There's no doubt about it. And we'll get really deep in the weeds, but you were going to say something, Patty?
Well, I was going to, I've had a lot of thoughts flit through my mind, but what else is new? Um, one, I was noting that already there's a little bit of controversy there because it seems like half the population refuses to consider prior to birth as part of our lives, and balance that with the Chinese view that when you're born, it's your first birthday because you've already been around a year.
Yeah.
So two very opposite views. Personally, I'm with your camp, that life begins on day one of conception. But I'm also, going to confirm that you don't usually hear that language, even in our circle. Although we all talk about that prenatal period as part of our lives because we all recognize what happened to us, right? But
Absolutely.
it's not always talked about. You're right about that.
It's not, but it should be. I mean, if you take out any politics, let's just be scientists today.
Yeah.
It is so clear from the science because the first 1,000 days of life, this research says it holds great possibilities
Mhm.
for development throughout the lifespan. So if someone is pregnant and doing everything they should be doing, the child's born, they're born into a very stable, loving, responsive home, they're getting proper nourishment, they're getting proper sleep, that sets that child up for success.
Mhm.
But the first 1,000 days of life are also a very vulnerable period where if there is insults in utero from alcohol, drugs, even pollution exposure, there's tons of literature talking about endocrine disruptors. Mom's pregnant, has diabetes untreated. Mom's obese. Mom has infections that she hasn't taken care of through pregnancy. Anything that happens to mom personally and in her environment can impact that developing child in utero. So maybe mom's doing everything by the book, but she's living in an environment where there's an abusive partner and there's just so much stress.
Mhm.
Any kind of stress as well
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
impact that child's developing brain in
Oh,
utero.
hugely, because it
Yeah.
basically breaks the the developing internal thermostat for the stress hormones and the regulation of stress in that child.
Yeah, we got the HPA axis that can be
Mm-hmm.
impacted, the developing amygdala, the prefrontal cortex. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So, looking at the first 1,000 days of life literature, it sometimes asks the question, what kind of stress was going on during that time span? What kind of trauma? Did that stress reach a full-blown trauma? And
Mm-hmm.
trauma can come in many shapes, sizes, and forms, where it can be obvious, where it's sexual abuse, physical abuse. But trauma can be like invalidation,
Mm-hmm.
minimization, neglect. That
Yeah.
child being a baby, maybe parents leave for multiple hours a day, and that baby's just left in a crib crying and
Mm.
crying and crying and doesn't learn how to self-soothe. And unfortunately, there are cases too in the work I do in sugar. You look at some of that literature, there's a sizable minority of children under the age of 1 who drink a lot of sugar sweetened beverages. I mean, that's a whole nother
Mm-hmm.
can of worms, but that can lead to adverse outcomes. Poverty. Was there any kind of poverty during that first 1,000 days of life?
Mm-hmm.
Was there any violence exposure in the home or in the community? So any one of these things, and there's many, many more, depending on the child, depending on all kinds of factors, epigenetics, what was the nutrition like, that's the stage in a child's life where the auditory systems are developing and visual sensory systems and your learning capabilities and your memory and information processing. And these are some of the reasons why when someone's exposed to drugs or alcohol in utero, they have more learning problems, more memory issues, more
Mm-hmm.
information processing, more sensory issues because it's insulting
Yeah.
the parts of the brain that are responsible for those functions as that child gets older.
Yeah. Yeah. So what um what would you say is the number one things that parents need to provide for their kiddos in that first 1,000 days?
Nutrition comes to the top of the list, the
Mhm.
research says, because if there are deficiencies in nutrition in utero, that has been linked with brain-based impairments, body impairments, all kinds of things. So really looking at what kind of nutrition mom is consuming during pregnancy. Could be lack thereof. Could it be meal skipping? Could it be an eating disorder that the mom's dealing with during pregnancy? Could it be food insecurity where mom wants to eat healthy but just doesn't have the means,
Mm.
the access? Could it be a mom who just loves fast food and doesn't connect the dots that the overconsumption of fast food or foods that fall into the Western diet
Mm.
are very bad for her health and that developing child in utero? So nutrition really at the top of the list, but I guess one other thing I'd put at the top of the list is sleep. How much sleep
Mhm.
is mom getting? Because if she's chronically sleep deprived in the work I do with sleep disorders, in that literature, you will find a few studies talk about that sleep begins prenatally. So it's fascinating research. It's not just
Yeah.
what, again, happens after birth. That child's developing brain, circadian rhythms, the hormones, and all the sleep cycles start getting established during fetal development. And
I never
what
knew
mom
that. That's
does,
fascinating.
it really is. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
just the science of this is just really, really important for us to all know.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay. So a lot of times, women don't know for anywhere from 1 to 3 months that they're carrying a child. And there is that kind of prevention um, jingle that, pregnant moms never drink alone, which I think is genius. Um, you mentioned that our society, does a lot of fast food. So what is it about our diet that is so poor for the developing baby? Is it all the salts? Is it all the preservatives? What are those effects upon the developing
Keep going.
baby?
You're naming them all off. Sugar, emulsifiers, all kinds of ingredients you can't pronounce, the
Okay.
over consumption of calories that are very dense, but probably don't have a lot of nutritional value.
Okay. So
Taste good.
you said something there. A lot of things you probably cannot pronounce, right? Aside from the joke that just crossed my mind about it was a meme saying you're trying to pronounce the generic name of your medications and call up Satan by mistake. Um, we can say the same thing about the nutrition label. And I've heard it said that, and since you have certificates in nutrition, I'm going to assume you're the expert to ask. I've heard it said that your body does not know how to handle those things that are made in a lab that we really can't pronounce well. Um, and I happened to be thinking at the time, well, maybe this is why, with the diabetes, I had started doing the meal replacements with Glucerna. It's a protein drink, thinking fewer calories, it's good for you. Um, and I actually ended up gaining weight. And I had heard that study that because your body does not know what to do with those substances, it just tucks it all away into the belly fat.
Some of your diet sodas, some of your sugar substitutes on the surface. No, you're not getting that sugar. But some of those, I'm not going to name names on what substance it is, but it can inflame your gut lining. So then you have inflammation in your gut. And we've talked about the gut brain health axis before. That can trigger a whole storm of different neurochemicals in the body. Chronic inflammation is the driver of most diseases. So now if your gut's inflamed, which is the hub of immunity, most of your serotonin is produced there, half your dopamine is produced there, amongst all kinds of other things. Then you're more inflamed.
Mhm.
Your blood sugar levels become dysregulated. You might crave even more types of food, and you have a greater difficulty of losing weight. And one of
Mhm.
the best things you can do to lose weight is get good sleep and get your inflammation down. Obviously, it's more complicated than calories in, calories out. There's genetics, epigenetics factors, and that's a whole nother can of worms with obesity and putting on
Mhm.
weight. But it is a variable to take into account. And in the FASD world, there are some studies that do talk about obesity and
Mhm.
eating problems and being underweight in some cases as well.
Mhm. Um, and is it true that um, the whole popular cultural belief about the metabolism can be reinvigorated? I mean, it seems like half the diet fads going are based on that. Wake your metabolism up. I've also heard a lot of controversy about like, that's all BS.
It's tough to know. Where I come from with that, probably old fashioned. Eat healthy,
Mhm.
exercise, get good sleep, get off the screen,
Mhm.
laugh more, be around positive people, and just have a good mindset to get out in nature more. Again, is that going to fix every problem? Probably not, but
Yeah.
look around how many people do eat healthy, how many people get the recommended amount of sleep, how many people are on the screen way too long.
Yeah.
Excessive screen time exposure during that first 1,000 days of life, not good. There's
Yeah.
some studies too, while we're on this nutrition kick, and I'm not giving any nutritional advice, but I am working on a nutrition master's degree right now, so that'll be done in about a year, year and a half. There are some studies that say that sugar, coffee, canned foods, fried foods, sugar sweetened beverages, hard candies, snacks loaded with sugars should be avoided during the first years of life.
Mhm.
But talk to your pediatrician about that. But there's so many kids in the United States, according to the research, who are drinking sugar sweetened beverages, who are having fast food at such a young age, who are having all these processed ingredients. What is that
Mhm.
doing to that child's metabolism, their metabolic health as they get older?
Yeah.
Probably not helping the situation.
So I'm thinking now about all the free breakfast and free lunches that our kids get at school, and the relative nutritional value of a lot of what's available in those lunches. Any comments on that?
Great programs. I know a lot of those programs are trying to combat obviously hunger, food insecurity. I am not knocking any of those programs. And I don't know every program, every meal served, but this is a topic that did come up in one of my classes in the nutrition program I take. And some of these school-based lunch programs are loaded with sugars and
Mm,
salts and preservatives. So again, it's tough for me to comment on that. But if I go back to high school and think in my high school days, I graduated in 1996, vending machines in the school, you could get any
mhm,
pizza you wanted, any candy, any donuts.
yeah,
Some schools have changed that. Other people I've talked to, it's still the same thing.
yeah,
I hear this day in and day out. You go to prison, you come out more unhealthy. You go to hospitals a lot of times, you come out more unhealthy. Some of that is because of the food that's being served there in these
mhm,
environments, and that is supported in the literature. I'm not saying
mhm,
every hospital, every prison system, but there are
yeah,
studies that talk about those
yeah.
things.
Well, I graduated in 1980, and I remember, typical on the grilled cheese sandwich, cinnamon rolls, ice cream. I mean, it was all there. It was all there. Um, I can't even I can't even imagine eating as much as I used to eat then, and I was skinny as a rail. And now, like most postmenopausal women, I look at something and I gain weight. But back to the first 1,000 days. Um, if a woman is doing all that she can to provide that optimal environment, right? To be working on sleep, to be working on eating well, and that's a challenge depending on, economically. There's a big disparity with access to healthy food.
Absolutely, and time too. Maybe you have access
Mhm,
to healthy food, but I believe it takes more work to live a healthier life than
mhm,
it doesn't. I mean, that's just what I believe. People can disagree with that, but it does take a lot of work being intentional and being in the kitchen, chopping up fresh vegetables and fruits
mhm,
rather than going through the drive-through on the way home. And I get
mhm,
it. There's probably lots of people that raising families, working two jobs, doing school at night, bringing kids to all kinds of activities. It gets
mhm.
very tricky, even if you really have the means. So being aware
Mhm.
of the time factor, the
Yeah,
stress, just the day in and day out nature of our society, the
yeah.
go, go, go mentality.
Yeah, I did pretty well when I was single. I did all my cooking for the week on Sunday afternoons.
You're ahead of the game.
And but I haven't been able to carry that over into, current life, 2 part-time jobs, the business, the podcast, writing. Yeah, I don't have that kind of time.
It's
So,
tricky. Now, just think about this too. If it's a woman who's pregnant, but also has a very complex history of trauma herself,
mhm,
or has had a really difficult go at it throughout life, it makes it even more challenging. So we have to consider what kind of trauma, not just what was going on during pregnancy, but what kind of things were happening in this woman's life before she got pregnant.
mhm,
Abuse, poverty,
mhm,
is there racism, marginalization, stigma, oppression? Maybe there's intergenerational transmissions of trauma where her
mhm.
mom, her grandma and grandpa dealt with horrific traumas, and that was passed down generationally
Yeah,
through epigenetics.
yeah.
Is she dealing with severe mental health challenges and has limited family support and has a lot of fear of going out of the house and staying in contact with her healthcare providers?
Mhm,
COVID-19 was a whole host of issues that opened up.
yeah.
So that's another can of worms as well. Does she feel hopeless and helpless? And it was an unwanted pregnancy as a result of something bad that happened too. I mean, there's so many moving parts here that can
Mhm,
definitely impact that first 1,000 days.
yeah. Yeah. So the first thousand, well, first thousand is up to 2 years old.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, during pregnancy, we talked about the effect of stress, right? It kind of, because the cortisol and other stress hormones flow through the placenta, they very much they override the baby's developing mechanism for stress hormonal system, right? The HPA axis and whatnot. Um, what does that sudden loss of system override do to the baby?
Well, it probably will contribute if it went on repeatedly, it could contribute to more irritability and the reduced ability to self-soothe when that child is
Mhm,
born, which then that child might look extremely colicky, more clingy
mhm,
maybe, or maybe
mhm,
they don't want to be held as much. It could contribute then to that child not sleeping that well at night.
mhm.
And if the child's not sleeping, everyone else in the household's probably not getting good sleep. Maybe there's some issues with just taking the bottle appropriately. I
Mhm.
mean, working with a feeding specialist could be helpful. Early interventions around sensory can be very, very helpful. For
And
some of
we
these
know that
kids,
that's a thing with FASD,
oh,
not
sure,
suckling, right?
absolutely. And for some of these kids too, depending on the trauma, the in utero factors, and a variety of other factors, when they're born, they may be dealing with more stomach related issues. So we have the gut brain health access. They
Mhm,
could be dealing with more over acid production. I mean, there's so many different things.
mhm,
Maybe the child has a sensitivity to soy or dairy and so many
mhm,
variables take into account because like bottle feeding is another
mhm,
variable to consider.
mhm,
So early on in life, if you are a foster care parent, adoptive parent of a child that you know that was exposed to lots of difficult things early on in life, consulting with a nutritionist, consulting with a sensory specialist, consulting
mhm,
with the healthcare providers on a regular basis, very, very important. I'll
mhm.
throw another wrench into this that we probably don't think about. Mom, dad, everything's going great in the household during pregnancy. Throughout pregnancy, looking good, everything's great. Then you find out lots of lead exposure. You didn't even know
Ooh.
you had prenatal lead exposure going on. That is a whole nother can of worms that might be more common in certain parts of cities, might be
Mhm.
more common in some older cities around the United States.
So that would
Might
be due to lead in the plumbing, right?
plumbing, it could be old houses that have paint.
Mhm,
I mean, there's a whole, yeah, a whole host of things there, but lead exposure, I do a lot of work in the ACEs research, the adverse childhood experiences literature. And in there, I always talk about there's some research that shows children with a high degree of childhood poverty, homelessness, high trauma may actually be at greater risk for lead exposure early on in life as well.
okay.
So
Tell
definitely
tell me
something.
how that is. How does that work?
You're living in poverty, you're probably living in an environment where maybe the house isn't up to code. It's a rundown, dilapidated living situation. There's older pipes.
Mhm.
There's chipping paint that maybe has lead in it from decades and decades ago. Maybe it's a
So
part of the country where it's just really an old city and lots of things have never been updated.
or your children's toys coming from China are painted with lead paint.
I don't know all the ones that are painted with lead paint, but it is another variable to be
Mhm,
aware of. Yes,
mhm.
definitely.
I know that was a big stink not too terribly long ago, just a couple years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about, here's another and I'm just only throwing out a few here, but prenatal air pollution exposure. Google
Mhm,
that.
mhm,
If mom during pregnancy was exposed to asbestos, carbon monoxide, radon, lots of dust, mold. So again, maybe she's living in a really rundown living situation and there's a lot of mold in there. Or she's exposed to lots of fumes and chemicals and paints. Maybe she works in a factory through pregnancy and she's breathing in lots of chemicals
mhm,
and fumes. It really depends on a lot of factors, but prenatal air pollution exposure has been studied within the context of premature birth, low birth weight, developmental problems,
Mhm.
alterations in that child's immune system. So as they get older, they might have more immune system functioning issues.
Yeah.
So there's just a multitude of factors to consider, but just know that these are all kinds of technically they'd be all stressors or traumas on
Mhm.
that developing child in utero.
On one level, this is very disheartening because one would suppose that the the barrier, the placenta is a more effective barrier than it apparently is between mom and child.
For some things, yes, for some things, no, and it depends
Mhm.
on the severity and the duration of it. When your audience is listening to this and maybe they feel overwhelmed, maybe they feel stressed out, maybe they feel like, oh, there's just so much. Where do I start?
Yeah.
When I learned about this, it gave me hope because I have more awareness about all the moving parts now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this should alert people, and this is not routinely done in the healthcare system. Routinely screen for these things. There are tests that you can get from healthcare providers or functional medicine providers
Mhm.
that can test for some of these things. Rule out
Yeah.
a food allergy, rule
Yeah.
out environmental toxins. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do.
Mhm. Mhm. Now, is there a way of getting your home environment looked at affordably?
Yeah, I know where I live, the city here where I live, they do have a division through the city where if you call them, they'll come out and do an inspection of your house for lead.
Okay.
I mean, so every city's different. I live in Minnesota, but it depends. I mean, if you're yeah, I mean, you can, most places have lead testing.
Mhm.
Radon, that's a whole nother can of worms. I mean, there's radon testing kits,
So
but things
radon comes from where does that
the
emanate?
ground, it comes from the
Okay.
ground. We have a lot of radon in my house, so we had to get a radon mitigation unit in here. It sucks it out somehow. But what we can do, I think nutritionally, that's something that can be done
Mhm.
with somewhat ease. It depends again with financial things like that. Looking at your home environment, setting it up for a calm, peaceful,
Mhm.
sensory friendly environment. That's
Mhm.
something we can probably do fairly easily.
Yeah.
Being aware of our technology use habits, cutting
So
that down.
so I think there's a fine line in terms of decor, right? Between the sensory environment with the recommendation of, going zen, right? Nice and calming, for our kids with ASD or autism spectrum or FASD, having so many sensory sensitivities that having that calming environment without a lot of visual stimulation that keeps us going, ah. Um, so we have that on the one hand, and then you have the early childhood development that says, they need the stimulation, do bright colors, the primary colors, and how do you balance that? How do you know which way to go when
Talk to
you're
a
decorating your
specialist.
rooms?
Yeah, I would work with a specialist who that's what they do, and they could give evidence-based recommendations because a child with FASD might be different than a child with autism versus
Mhm,
ADHD versus a child with just a lot of trauma but doesn't have one of these diagnoses.
mhm,
So, and we all need sensory, and that is talked about obviously is foundational during this first 1,000 days of life. But maybe for some people, that sensory stimulation comes from working with a play therapist or equine
mhm,
therapy or music therapy.
mhm,
Every child is different, so having an evaluation early on in life is important. But at the core here, Patty, is safety, security, a loving
mhm,
home, just parental warmth
mhm.
rather than parental harshness, using that as the foundation
Yeah.
and then build on that. Good nutrition, good
Mhm,
sleep, getting a
mhm.
good service plan, a treatment plan in place.
So I can hear my audience asking now, where do we get the assessment? How do we access that?
Well, you'd start working with your pediatrician. I mean, that would
Mhm,
probably be the starting point. And if it's a child that has some different challenges, it depends. Maybe you're noticing some sensory issues.
mhm,
Maybe you're noticing that child after they have their bottle is just dealing with extreme colickiness, gut
mhm,
issues, extreme diarrhea, constipation. Would it be beneficial talking to the pediatrician, getting a referral to a nutritionist?
mhm.
Maybe, definitely.
Okay.
In the
So
parenting literature too, it does talk about parenting begins prenatally as well. So getting some parenting classes on these things and just educating yourself about some of these basic things. I'm not asking people to be experts on lead or mold or mercury or anything like that, but understanding attachment and trauma informed and healthy nutrition, I mean, those would be
yeah,
things I would highly recommend.
yeah. And a lot of what you've talked about a little earlier in this recording and has really brought to mind, where I have come in with the whole nature versus nurture thing, where, nurture in, looking at the environment after birth, it does have so much to contribute, but the foundation upon which nurture makes its impact de- depends on nature, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we
Yeah.
do have both going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always both. People want to say, is it one or the other? I've never really seen a case where it wasn't both to one extent or another.
I do think it's both.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What I know, a lot of the people that I have worked with have said, Patty, I've tried going to the pediatrician and asking about this or asking about that, and I get poo-pooed all the time. Oh, it's nothing. Oh, they'll grow out of it. Oh, it's normal. What do you say to that? If you have that gut instinct that there's something amiss, there's something not quite right, how do you advocate for that?
I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
A lot of pediatricians, and they're all brilliant, smart people, way smarter than me. And MD is very hard stuff, but a lot of them don't. I don't think a lot of them think very holistically. So
Mhm.
there is a growing movement in the medical field for lifestyle medicine. That would be a term to be aware of.
Okay.
Finding pediatricians who understand and looking at this holistically, because let's say you bring your child to the doctor because the child is dealing with constipation issues. Maybe the doctor, the first thing, okay, here's a med. Well, the
Mhm.
constipation might be a leaf of the problem. Somebody that thinks holistically or functionally and goes deeper in the weeds, could that constipation be caused by earlier life trauma?
Mhm.
Could it be a nutritional deficiency? Could they be lactose intolerant? Could they be there's a million reasons for these things. You
Yeah.
have to peel back the layers, get into the weeds.
Yeah.
That's holistic thinking. That's functional medicine thinking. That's more lifestyle
Yeah.
approaches, things like that. And sometimes one professional doesn't have all these expertise. So sometimes parents have to piece it together
Mhm.
with different providers as well.
So is there a movement in the medical community to get more insurance carriers to cover functional doctors?
That I haven't heard. It doesn't mean it's not, but the one thing I should say, yes, some of these things I'm saying, like some testing with functional providers, unfortunately, are not covered by a lot of insurances.
Mhm.
I know
Mhm.
somebody that got their child I don't know the exact name, but it was a digestive health test
Mm.
where they had to put a stool sample in and send it away, and they got a whole host of reports, data, and they found out the child had some gut dysbiosis, some C. diff, some different bacterial things in there. So they were working with their medical provider in conjunction with their
Okay.
naturopathic doctor and treating it holistically through nutritional intervention, supplementation, different kinds of probiotics that were tailored for
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
person. So, but they had to pay out of pocket,
Yeah.
which we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, which is not always feasible for every family. It's very, very
Yeah.
tricky.
That's a steep cost, and I think
It
that's
really
part of the
is.
disparity that we're
I
talking
agree.
about in access to the
Yes.
answers that we need, which is unfortunate. But I think a bit of this also is the shortcomings in the way our system is structured for the most part, where insurance carriers seem to be driving the bus much of the time. Um,
It's yes.
they've been driving the bus for a long time in terms of doctors over testing in order to CYA, right? Cover your butt. Um, yeah, I ruled this out, I ruled this out. And so they put you through every test under the sun, which a lot of times isn't necessary. I mean, to give you a good example, when I was 49, my endo said, it's time you go see a cardiologist, just to get a baseline, right? You've been diabetic forever and a day. And we need to have a baseline by which we can measure all the change. And the doctor that I saw, he very quickly found an issue, and it turned out I didn't need any surgery follow-up on the angiogram, because God had already built the detour around the blockage. But um, very soon afterward, he joined a larger practice. And then every 6 months, I was having very expensive tests run for years. And he retired, and my new cardiologist is not in that practice. And I haven't had a single test in 3 years. What do you know?
Interesting.
So,
Yeah, there are definitely some challenges in the healthcare arena as a whole, I think, in the United States.
yeah. And I know a lot of people believe that naturopaths, right, or the DOs instead of the MDs are not covered because they're not in bed with pharmacology, with big pharm.
Can't comment on that, but I would say there's a lot
Yeah.
of challenges. There's a lot of good, but
I
I think, in my opinion, if the Western medicine would start infusing the holistic approaches together and
mhm.
not throw out the Western medicines are still important, surgery is
Oh,
important, but
absolutely.
there's other things we can
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
preventatively and digging deeper and getting the right
Yeah.
diagnosis and the right answers.
Yeah. Yeah, when I brought that up, I wasn't endorsing it. I'm not saying I agree with it, but the belief for the hypothesis is out there.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
yeah.
There is a movement too, Patty. Some in the United States, more in Europe, social prescribing as well. That's another term. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I've not. What is that?
So basically, let's say if a doctor socially prescribes, you go to the doctor, you report you're feeling depressed. Rather than the doctor prescribing a medication for that depression off the bat, they're prescribing that person to go join an art group or a singing group or a walking group,
Mm,
doing a more holistic approach.
mhm.
So, not a
Yeah.
lot of doctors, I think, are doing that yet, but there are what you can Google
Yeah.
social prescribing
Yeah.
movement in the United States. It's common sense. I mean,
It totally is. And
yeah.
it really brings to mind one of the things I learned in getting certified with the neurobehavioral model is if you are um, seeking a provider because of symptoms of depression or symptoms of anxiety before or symptoms of ADHD, before you start taking a medication, you should go through the inventory and figure out what your strengths are, what your challenges are, and go the route of developing accommodations and putting those in place, fine tuning the accommodations for the challenges that we have that are based on the FASD. And
Yeah, I
if
mean,
after those things are in place, the symptoms continue, then yes, assume that it truly is depression or anxiety or ADHD or bipolar, because we can legitimately have both. but oftentimes the providers are looking at, they hear hoofbeats, they think of horses. They're used to anxiety, so that's their go-to is the anxiolytics. They're used to depression, that's their go-to. When a lot of it just might not be a good fit between the person and their environment.
We could talk about attention quite a bit, but there's like 80 plus reasons why someone could have attentional deficit problems that look like ADHD when maybe it's gut dysbiosis, it's a food allergy, it's sleep apnea untreated, it's
Mhm,
trauma, it's excessive screen time exposure. The list goes
mhm,
on and on and on.
mhm.
So it can look like it, walk like it, talk like it, but in some cases, it might not be that. So
Yeah,
that requires a
yeah,
holistic functional approach to really rule out neuro, bio, psychosocial, prenatal,
yeah.
postnatal factors, including possible genetic factors as well.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I often say that FASD is the zebra. It sounds like a horse, but it's the zebra. So you've mentioned a term a couple times, dysbiosis. Can you define that for everybody? And then after that, we need to wrap up because I know your time is very limited.
Let's just we did a recording on the gut brain health axis, didn't we?
We,
I thought we did, but I could be
yeah,
wrong.
but just in case
So
people have not, just
when
super quick definition.
when you think of just think of the gut not working, there's an imbalance in the gut between good bacteria, bad bacteria. So gut dysbiosis, it could be triggered by lots of stress. You stay up
Mhm.
all night long and you're meeting a deadline and pounding down the coffee, energy drinks. Your gut is in out of
So
balance.
it's
And when our
just
gut is
that's what
out,
it is.
yeah,
It's
it's
being
just
out of
our gut is
balance.
not
Okay.
working at optimal levels. So
Okay. Okay. Good
can I
enough.
leave us on a positive note?
Absolutely. Please do.
When you think of the first 1,000 days of life, we've covered a lot of things, and this is a very
Yeah.
small snapshot. If we had another few hours, we could get through the most of the variables. But here's a really practical thing that we can do to really promote child development is happiness.
Mm,
If you are a family focused on laughter and joy and gratitude and optimism and empathy and compassion and kindness and warmth, that shows profound benefits for the child's brain, their
mhm,
physical development, their social development. It plays
mhm,
a role in emotional regulation,
mhm.
play behaviors, giving your child a hug, having good eye contact, having meals together. I mean, these are just
Yeah.
happiness, promoting
Yeah.
happiness and joy in that household can be a great thing
Yeah. And I dare say that continues way beyond the first 1,000 days,
without a doubt.
even
And everything we're
for
talking
all
about,
of
it's
us, right? Laughter is good
absolutely
medicine.
yes,
And
yes,
it's
yes.
also true that one cannot simultaneously experience both fear and play, right? Play
I
dispels
don't
fear.
You would think so. Yeah, if you can
Yeah.
distract, maybe it's part mindfulness too. You're really
Yeah.
distracting and focusing on the moment at hand.
Yeah. Well, everybody, I can't believe this. Our time together has disappeared again way too quickly. Dr. Jerrod Brown, thank you for coming back on again.
You're
Our
welcome.
time together is always valuable. I always get good feedback on your episodes. So I'm so pleased to provide this space for you to educate so many people.
Thank you,
Um,
my friend. Always enjoy being here and talking with you.
Yeah. Everybody, thank you for tuning in this week. Please remember to come back next week for another episode of Living with FASD. And in the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time on Living with FASD podcast. I'm your coach, your FASD coach, Patti Kasper. Take care. Bye bye.